Was there a stable realization for you that preceded unity consciousness or oneness?
Yes, there was. There was a stable realization prior to unity consciousness or oneness. Um, it's called self-realization or cosmic consciousness. And this was something that just happened spontaneously. In fact, you were there at the time. We were at our friend's house at a group meditation, and I was meditating, and then suddenly this shift took place, and my perspective changed. And what I noticed in that moment is that I was released from this sense of being constrained by my body mind. My sense of identity had shifted from this localized sense of a person into what I call pure conscious being. That was really quite remarkable and unexpected. I don't think it had a lot to do with the fact that I was meditating at the moment it happened. I think the preparation was over a longer period of time, and that just happened to be the moment divine grace showed up and conveyed this awakening. It was very obvious in the moment what had happened. What I remember about it is that I didn't have any doubt. It just seemed really clear and obvious what had taken place. And, I also had the benefit of the teachings of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who I'd studied, and he had laid out a whole series of stages of awakenings. And cosmic consciousness is what he called, what other people call self-realization. And that was pretty clear. That's what had happened. So I think that really served me well, having that context in which to understand what had happened. And, right away I noticed that even though there was this shift of perspective, this sense of being had completely changed, that my life just seemed to be the same. What we call Joel, the personal self, didn't go away. There was still the behavior, the thoughts, the preferences, everything that Joel was still there. And I think I actually expected that not to be the case. I conceived of cosmic consciousness as something where all of that just goes away. And there are many teachings that say that, the ego is destroyed or there's no more personal self. But that was just not my experience. And that did trigger not doubts about what had happened, but it did trigger questions about, okay, what is the real experience of this awakening? If the personal self doesn't disappear, then what is living? And so that was the beginning of the process of finding out the answer to that.
So this was a stable realization, not merely a temporary experience?
Yes, it was a stable realization. I can't say I knew that initially. I needed some time to determine that. But this persistent, unbounded sense of self, this sense of being that had gone from being really constrained into this space in my head, primarily, which was now, without limit, without dimension. And that was my ongoing sense of being from that point forward. And it persisted regardless of what I was doing. So I could be engaged in a task where my attention was focused, or I could just be out for a walk and enjoying nature. I could be talking to people, or whatever people do in their lives. This is what I did. That didn't change. But this persistent sense of unbounded presence of being that I was there. I noticed the stability of it, but I really did have this strange impulse to test it. So I actually requested, you could say, of the universe that I wanted to be tested. I wanted to find out how stable this was. I had a really terrible period of time after that in terms of things that were going on in my life. really challenging, very stressful. And that did not perturb this sense of being, this sense of myself. I guess I didn't regret requesting that it be tested, but I have to say, I think I probably would have preferred to not have so much tumult and chaos for that period of time in which that test took place.
And what was the felt sense of this realization?
Well, the felt sense was one of freedom, this profound release, a sense of no longer being contracted. That was the first aspect of it that I noticed. That was immediate. And that freedom brought with it this feeling of peace and serenity, and there was an arising of bliss also with all of that. Prior to this awakening to cosmic consciousness, my sense of being was just really contained in this sense of really the space of my head in the body-mind. And in the moment that this changed, that contraction was released. And I realized how contained and contracted I'd been. In my experience, there was this distinctive shift of perspective, almost like it felt like the whole world got pushed away from me, that I was way, way back in space and experiencing that as infinite. And yet the world was way, way out there in front of me. There was a very clear distinction between that sense of being an observer of experience and where the experience was actually happening. So there was clearly no sense of unity about it. But at the same time, it was clear that all of this phenomena that was happening as experience was actually arising on the basis of my sense of self, that it wasn't seen as the content of experience wasn't seen as my sense of self, but it was arising on the sense of self, where you could say it was contained in the sense of self. But it was like being contained, but not recognized as the sense of self. Something else I noticed in my behavior was that there was more spontaneity. It was like certain governors or filters that had been at play were not operating to the same degree. So I found myself saying or doing things that I previously would have interfered with or tried to mediate. It's not like I went wild and crazy, but I just noticed these subtle shifts that had to do with the way that I expressed in the world. So what I felt had happened is that the sense of self had just sifted out from the constraints of experiencing, and it had just pulled itself out, it had awakened out of that, had awakened from the identification with the body, mind, the ego, the personal self, what have you, that it now was independent. And of course, it always was, but due to the process of identification, it hadn't been seen that way. So it was pure conscious being, or the sense of self in cosmic consciousness, that had awakened due to divine grace out of this sense of identification with the body mind. Not long after this shift had taken place, the light of consciousness turned on. That was beautiful, awesome. It was clear to me that this light of consciousness was actually the mechanism, the capacity for having experience, for perceiving anything. It's like if you could imagine being in a dark room with a flashlight, and you shine the flashlight around in the darkness, and it illuminates an object in that space. And then you can see the object, but you can't see it until the light shines on it. And this is how the function of the light of consciousness was. It was the light of consciousness somehow coordinated with the function of attention that illuminated whatever was in the experience. And that illumination is not really, unlike my analogy of the flashlight in the darkness, that illumination is not that localized to one object at a time. It's actually happening throughout the whole scope of perception, all at the same time. But when attention then focuses on something, the intensity of that light of consciousness becomes even more evident. So there's the underlying luminosity of the light of consciousness underlying all perception, but then there's this focus that attention brings to it.
Would you say that there was a characteristic feeling tone, though, throughout this period, such as joy, elation, bliss?
There was, of course, that initial sense of freedom and release that took place at the moment of awakening. But there was also this ongoing peace and serenity and some degree of bliss that became part of my ordinary experience, kind of a natural flow of peace and serenity and bliss. And when the light of consciousness came on, that bliss was really amplified. That really got amped up. So there was a way in which the light of consciousness itself really carried an intensity of bliss inherent in it. And there was a bliss in perception itself, that when the light shone on whatever was being experienced in the field of perception, that enhanced the quality. There was a clarity in the perception. There was an underlying sense of vibrancy and all of that, along with this feeling of bliss. And so, even though there was this really clear distinction between myself and whatever was being perceived, there was still this quality, this glow that was cast upon the process of perception, that glow coming from the pure conscious being as myself, that inherently had the quality of bliss, peace, and joy, but along with this light of consciousness, which brought that in with more intensity. Now, all this is not to say that I was in a constant state of bliss and joy, because life still continued to happen. And so all of that turmoil or chaos or stress or anxiety or whatever is arising in experience of living is actually happening on the level of the personal self. It's not happening on the level of pure conscious being. And so there's a way in which even the things that arise in life, which might not be pleasant or might be stressful, those are contextualized in this profound context of pure conscious being. So they're still not pleasant, but I should say the pleasant things still are pleasant. But the difficult aspects of living are still not pleasant, and they still can arise. It's not like all that stops happening. Life continues as it did before. So when I look back at this whole process, which began with self-realization or cosmic consciousness, I came to see how the process unfolds and some of its mechanics that were not necessarily consistent with the model of stages of awakening that I had received from my teacher Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, but I began to see it firsthand. So it gave me a different perspective as the process unfolded. And living in cosmic consciousness prepared the ground for what unfolded after that.